I wasn't looking for secrets. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't snooping. I was just trying to find a stapler. But what I found instead changed my marriage, changed my future, changed the man I thought I knew, because hidden inside a dusty drawer was a stack of court papers, legal documents, monthly payments, a child's name I had never heard before, and next to it, my husband's signature. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a clerical error. But when I confronted him, he didn't deny it, he didn't explain it, he didn't apologize. He broke down and said, "That child isn't mine." And that's when I realized this story wasn't about a child. It was about a woman and the life he was hiding from me. Part 1. The marriage I believed in. I met my husband, Marcus, when I was 27. He was confident, successful, charismatic, the kind of man who made you feel safe just by standing next to him. We met at a charity fundraiser. I was volunteering. He was donating. He struck up a conversation, complimented my smile, asked about my work. We talked for over an hour. At the end of the night, he asked for my number. We went on our first date the next weekend dinner. A walk by the river, deep conversation. He told me he'd been married before, divorced, no children, he said. I learned a lot from that marriage. What not to do. I want to do things right this time. I admired his honesty, his maturity, his self-awareness. We dated for 2 years. He was consistent, reliable, present. He introduced me to his family. They loved me. I introduced him to mine. They trusted him. We traveled. We built memories. We built plans. He proposed on a quiet evening at home. No cameras, no crowd, just us. He said, "I don't want anyone else. I want you, for life." I said yes without hesitation. We got married 6 months later. A small ceremony, close friends, close family. No drama, no secrets. Or so I thought. Part 2. The life we built. Marriage felt easy, not perfect, but peaceful. We worked, we saved, we bought a house. We adopted a dog. We hosted dinners. We celebrated holidays. We talked about kids. Not immediately, but someday, he said. I want to be a father when I am ready to be a good one. I respected that. I wasn't in a rush. We had time, or so I thought. He worked long hours, but he always called, always checked in, always came home. We shared passwords, shared schedules, shared goals. There was no reason not to trust him until the day I found the papers. Part 3. The discovery. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary, boring. I was reorganizing the home office, sorting through old files, receipts, manuals, warranty cards. I opened a drawer that had always been locked, but that day it wasn't. Inside was a manila folder, thick, heavy, unlabeled. I opened it. The first page was a court order. My heart skipped. The second page was a payment schedule, monthly child support payments. The third page, a child's name, a woman's name, a court case number, and at the bottom, my husband's signature. I felt dizzy. I read it again, and again, and again. I whispered, "This can't be real." Marcus had told me he had no children. This document said otherwise. Or so I thought. I sat on the floor, holding the papers, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I tried to think of explanations. Maybe it was from before our marriage. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was identity theft. Maybe it was fraud. But the signature was his. The dates were recent. The payments were current. I checked our bank statements. There they were. Monthly withdrawals, consistent, silent, hidden, labeled as legal expense. My hands shook. I waited until he came home. Part 4. The confrontation that night. When he walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table. The papers were laid out neatly, in order, like evidence. He looked tired, kissed my forehead, then saw my face. "What's wrong?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just slid the folder toward him. He froze. His face went pale. He swallowed. "I can explain," he said. I said, "Start." He sat down, stared at the papers, ran his hands through his hair. "This isn't what you think," he said. I said, "You're paying child support." He said, "Yes." I said, "You told me you didn't have children." He said, "I don't." I said, "Then why are you paying child support?" He said, "Because." Then he stopped. Not a tear, not a sniffle. He broke, full body, hands shaking, voice cracking. He said, "That child isn't mine." I stared at him. "What, that child isn't mine?" he repeated. I said, "Then why are you paying?" He said, "Because I had to." I said, "Had to? How?" He said, "It's complicated." I said, "Make it simple." He took a deep breath. "There was a woman," he said, "before we were married, before we were even engaged. I had an affair." My heart dropped. "With who?" I asked. He said, "A woman named Elena." I said, "And she had a child?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And you're paying child support for her child?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Even though the child isn't yours?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because." Then he hesitated. Then he said, "Because she threatened to destroy my life." Part 5. The blackmail. He told me everything. Not slowly, not gently, all at once. Like he had been carrying it for years and couldn't hold it anymore. He said, "I met Alina at work. She was a consultant. We worked closely for months. I was lonely. My first marriage had just ended. I wasn't in a good place. I made a mistake." He said, "We started seeing each other. It was supposed to be casual. It wasn't. She got attached. I tried to end it. She didn't accept it," he said. Then she told me she was pregnant. I panicked. I asked for a DNA test. She refused. She said she didn't need my permission. She said the child was mine. He said, "I told her I didn't believe her," she said. Then his voice dropped. She said she would tell my ex-wife. She said she would tell my employer. She said she would tell my family. She said she would ruin me. I said, "So you believed her?" He said, "No, but I was scared," he said. She said she would accuse me of abuse. She said she would accuse me of coercion. She said she would accuse me of harassment. She said she would accuse me of rape. I felt sick. He said she had messages, she had photos, she had recordings. Out of context but damaging, he said. She told me if I paid her child support, she would disappear. She would never contact me again. She would never come after me. She would never expose me, I said. And you believed her? He said, yes, I said. So instead of telling the truth, you chose to lie, he said. Yes, I said. So instead of trusting me, you chose to hide, he said. Yes, I said. So instead of protecting our marriage, you chose to protect yourself. He didn't answer, because the answer was yes. Part 6. The betrayal within the betrayal. I wasn't just hurt by the affair, I was hurt by the lies, by the secrecy, by the financial betrayal, by the deception, by the fact that he looked me in the eyes for years and told me he had no children, while secretly paying for one, even if the child wasn't his. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "I was ashamed." I said, "You should have been honest." He said, "I was afraid you'd leave." I said, "So you lied to keep me?" He said, "Yes." I said, "That's not love." He said, "I know." I said, "You took away my choice." He said, "I'm sorry, but sorry didn't undo the betrayal. Sorry didn't erase the lies. Sorry didn't restore the trust. Sorry didn't give me back the years." I asked, "Have you ever met the child?" He said, "No." I asked, "Have you ever seen her?" He said, "No." I asked, "Have you ever been to their home?" He said, "No." I asked, "Have you ever had contact with her since the agreement?" He said, "No." I said, "So you've been paying for years for a child you've never met, for a woman you don't see, for a secret you don't talk about." "Yes," he said. I felt numb.
Something didn't sit right, not just emotionally, logically, legally. I said, "Why child support?" He said, "Because that's what she demanded." I said, "Did you go to court?" He said, "No." I said, "Then why is there a court order?" He froze. "I don't know." He said, "You don't know." She sent me the papers. She said they were filed. I said, "Did you verify?" He said, "No." I said, "Did you speak to a lawyer?" He said, "No." I said, "Did you ask for a DNA test?" He said, "Yes." She refused. I said, "Did you file a motion to compel?" He said, "No." I said, "Did you ask for proof of paternity?" He said, "No." I said, "So you just trusted her?" "Yes." I looked at him and realized something terrifying. This man, who I thought was smart, who I thought was responsible, who I thought was careful, had been manipulated not just emotionally, legally, financially, strategically, and that meant this wasn't just a secret. This was a scam. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't throw things. I didn't threaten. I did something else. I started investigating, not emotionally, logically. I took the documents and went to a lawyer, a family law attorney. I said, "Is this legitimate?" She looked at the papers and said, "This is not a real court order." My heart skipped. "What?" I asked. "This document was never filed with the court. This case number doesn't exist. This judge's name is wrong. This stamp is fake. This is not legally binding." My hands shook. "So he's not legally required to pay?" I asked. "No," she said. "He's been voluntarily sending money for years." I felt dizzy. Then she said, "There's more." "What?" I asked. She can't collect child support without establishing paternity, and she refused to do that. And there's no legal record of a child support order. So what is this? I asked. "This is blackmail," she said. "Financial extortion, fraud, coercion." My heart pounded. "So she's been lying?" I asked. "Yes, and he's been paying." I asked. "Yes, and the child isn't his." I asked. "Probably not," she said, "and she knows that." I asked. Yes, I felt sick, not just at her, at him, for believing her, for not verifying, for not protecting himself, for not protecting us. I confronted him again, this time, not emotionally, legally, logically. I said, "This document is fake." He said, "What?" "There is no court order. There is no case. There is no judge. You've been sending her money voluntarily." His face went pale. She said, "She lied." I said, "She has been blackmailing you." He sank into a chair. "She threatened me. She threatened to expose me. She threatened my career. She threatened my reputation." I said, "She had no legal power. You gave her power." He cried. Not out of sadness, out of realization, out of shame, out of regret. "I ruined everything," he said. "Yes," I said. "You did." I didn't just walk away. I didn't just file for divorce. Not yet. I wanted accountability. Not revenge, justice. I told him, "You're going to stop paying her." He said, "She exposed me." I said, "Let her." He said, "She ruined me." I said, "She ruined herself." He said, "How?" I said, "Because we're going to the police." He said, "No." I said, "Yes." I said, "This is extortion. This is fraud. This is blackmail. This is a crime." He hesitated. I said, "If you don't do this, I will." He looked at me and said, "Okay." We went to the police. We brought the documents, the emails, the payment history, the threats, the lawyer's report, everything. The police opened an investigation. They subpoenaed her records. They requested a DNA test, court-ordered. She couldn't refuse. The results came back, 0% probability. The child was not his, not biologically, not legally, not in any way. She had known. From the beginning, she had lied. She had manipulated. She had extorted. She had stolen. She had destroyed. She was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted for fraud, for extortion, for blackmail, for identity misuse, for emotional distress, for financial exploitation. She lost custody. She lost her job. She lost her reputation. She lost everything. Not because I destroyed her, but because she destroyed herself. So now you're probably thinking, did you stay? No, I didn't. Not because of her. Not because of the affair. Not even because of the money, but because of the lies. The secrecy, the lack of trust, the lack of honesty, the lack of courage. I said to him, "You didn't just cheat. You didn't just lie. You didn't just hide. You didn't just betray. You chose to protect yourself instead of your marriage. You chose fear instead of truth. You chose silence instead of honesty. And I can't build a future on that." He cried. "I love you." I said, "I know. That's what makes this harder. But love without trust is just attachment, and I deserve more than that." We divorced, not with anger, not with hatred, but with clarity. Healing wasn't quick. Healing wasn't easy. Healing wasn't clean. There were days I couldn't get out of bed. Days I cried in the shower. Days I questioned everything, my judgment, my instincts, my trust, my worth. But there were also days I laughed again. I slept peacefully. I woke up without anxiety. I felt safe in my own home. I didn't wonder what secrets were hidden. I didn't worry about lies. I didn't feel like I was living a double life. I was free, and freedom is peace. People think revenge is loud, public, explosive, destructive. but real revenge. It's quiet, it's healing, it's growth, it's peace. It's living a life so full that the people who hurt you no longer matter. He tried to rebuild his life. He apologized again, years later. I made the biggest mistake of my life, he said. I said, I know. He said, I wish I had told you. I said, I wish you had to. He said, I wish I could go back. I said, you can't. He said, do you hate me? I said, no, I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. And it doesn't mean reconciliation. He nodded and walked away. And I didn't feel pain. I felt closure. If you're watching this and you've been lied to, manipulated, gaslit, betrayed, let me tell you something. Truth always comes out. Not because people confess, but because lies collapse under their own weight. You deserve honesty. You deserve transparency. You deserve trust. And if someone chooses to hide, they are choosing to lose you. Not because you're unforgiving, but because you're self-respecting.